Hey everybody, it's Major. I know you already knew that, but I need to ask you a favor. Please stay with us to the end of the show because I have some really important information to share with you about this time we spend together, about the future of the Takeout. I'll talk to you then. Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. It's great to have you with us. This week's guest is someone that we can appreciate, we can sort of envy, and also say this. He is both prolific and brilliant, and that is a kind of troublesome combination. You know, we are usually tolerant of people who are brilliant, but not necessarily prolific, or prolific, but not necessarily brilliant. But come on, brilliant and prolific? That describes our guest this week, H.W. Brands. He has an exalted title at the University of Texas, Austin. I will defer to him to give that exalted title, but he is the author of many super important books on American history. His most recent, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. Bill, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us, and give my audience your exalted title at the great University of Texas, Austin.
Yes, and I have to articulate it carefully because it come out sounding wrong. It's the Jack S. Blanton Chair in History, not the Jackass Blanton.
Brilliant, prolific, and a great sense of humor. So here's where I want to start the conversation, ladies and gentlemen, because we live in an era where we hear something called America First. We also live in an era where we have a sitting president accused by some in the political right of being a dictator. We have some on the political left fearing that the next president, President-elect Trump, will be a dictator. We have a constant, almost relentless conversation about what is or isn't propaganda, what is or isn't misinformation, and what is the sum total of concentrated power in America. All these things we talk about right now, they all flow through this book that I'm talking to Bill Brands about, America First. Set the general stage for us, those arcs of conversation now, and how they resonated with Lindbergh and Roosevelt.
So the time period I cover in detail is from September 1st, 1939 to December 1941. And the focus of the book is the debate over whether the United States should enter World War II. But the broader question is, what should be America's role in the world? Should the United States conceive that the problems of Europe, for example, are America's problems? Or should America look more closely to its own more narrowly defined interests? Now, related to that is the question of who makes the decisions and how the decisions are made. And this is all wrapped up in the question of how much power the president has in particular, and how much Congress can or will check the power of the president. So these are issues we're discussing today as we decide how long the United States should continue to support Ukraine in its war against Russia, whether the United States should be prepared to defend Taiwan if attacked by China, what the American position in the Middle East ought to be. And related to that is how much of these decisions are made by the president essentially alone or within the executive branch, how much Congress plays a part, and beyond the president and Congress, what's the role of the American people in all of this? So these are questions we're dealing with now. These are questions that were thoroughly aired in the period from 1939 to 1941.
And pick apart the conversation back then about what was or wasn't propaganda or misinformation.
Okay, so the baseline of the American mood, the American consensus going into this period in the middle and late 1930s was that the United States should stay out of the affairs of Europe. The United States had had a long history of staying out of the affairs of Europe, with one important exception during World War I, an exception that Americans afterward came to believe had been a grave mistake, something not to be repeated. So it's important to bear in mind that going into this debate, the mindset, the consensus is different than it is today. In fact, it's just the opposite. We've today, for 80 years, have had the attitude that, yes, the United States must be the leader of the world. So when you talk about information, propaganda, argument, they start from different places, but they're arguing about the same thing. And so the argument back then was, well, to what extent the belligerence in the war, because September 1st, 1939 marks the outbreak of war in Europe, when Germany invades Poland and is subsequently had war declared upon it by France and Britain. So what it boils down to during most of this period is the position of Britain and Germany. And both Britain and Germany were doing their utmost to influence American public opinion. Because in those days, in somewhat contrast to the position we're in today, the American public, acting through Congress, had to get on board any decision to go to war. Presidents today, acting on precedent that really goes back to this period, but really started during the Cold War, presidents today can essentially put the United States into war, can move American military force in some place without a vote in Congress. And it's been often pointed out that Congress has not actually formally declared war since this very period, just the days after Pearl Harbor. But in the 1930s, early 1940s, Congress still clearly held the reins. And so the British had a propaganda bureau operating surreptitiously in New York and in Washington. And it was sending out the message that was most favorable to Britain. Britain is America's ally in democracy. The British people have nothing in the way of expansionist claims on Europe. They're just suffering under attacks from Germany. The Germans were doing very much the same thing. They were doing it less successfully, in part because there wasn't the common shared language, and they didn't have close connections within the Roosevelt administration. In fact, the Roosevelt administration was secretly working hand in glove with the British government to promote the British point of view, whereas the Germans were working on the outside. But there is a large population of Americans with roots in Germany. And so they were sort of playing there. And so we have this propaganda battle today, of course, it's waged on social media and on the internet.
Right.
Then it was waged usually in editorials and newspapers.
Right. And columns appeared, and they would not be recognizable necessarily as propaganda. So they were absorbed and digested in a way that they might have been differently absorbed and digested had people known who was actually behind it.
Yeah. So in fact, what would happen is the propaganda bureaus would put out talking points. And as you say, sometimes the talking points would be fully articulated editorials. And they would send them out. And if they resonated with the editors that they landed with, they were free to just use them as is. Now, the editors, well, sort of presumably knew what they were dealing with, except that both the British and the Germans were operating through front groups. So it was clear that this front group was favorable to Germany and this front group was favorable to Britain, but they didn't know that these were actually being funded by the governments of the two opposing belligerents. But the editors who would choose to run part or all of these, they didn't share with their readers where they came from.
So I want to start this conversation now, Bill. We have about a minute 30 before we go to our first break. Begin to sketch out for my audience who may not know, may not have a living memory, who Charles Lindbergh was.
Lindbergh became a star, a darling of the American people, one of the first real celebrities in American life, by the feat of flying across the Atlantic Ocean solo in 1927. He was this young, good-looking guy. He seemed to have all the characteristics of a son that American fathers, American mothers could embrace, somebody that they could tell their young boys to grow up to be like. So that was the impression of Lindbergh first. But then amid his celebrity, he suffered a personal tragedy. He and his wife had their infant son kidnapped and murdered. And so all of a sudden, there's this dark shadow across the bright light of, well, what until then had been called Lucky Lindy. And Lucky Lindy wasn't so lucky anymore. But he remained in the public eye, except that he was so in the public eye, he was so harassed by that generation of paparazzi that he took his wife and their family and they fled to England. And they lived in England for years to get out of the limelight. But his fame never quite disappeared. And when he came back before the outbreak of World War II, then the reporters were waiting at the dock to see, okay, here he is. What does Lucky Lindy have to say now?
That begins the sketching out of who Charles Lindbergh was and the battle to come, summarized in Bill Brand's book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh. We'll talk about Franklin Roosevelt and Lindbergh on the other side of this break. Segment 2 of the Takeout coming your way in just one moment.
Roosevelt would give his speech on the radio. Lindbergh would go on the radio, give his speech opposing, saying why Roosevelt was wrong and how it would lead to all these bad things.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Bill Brands is our special guest. His book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. This audience knows, I've said it many, many times, I am a proud son of San Diego, California. What I have not, I don't believe, before shared is that my elementary school was named Charles A. Lindbergh Elementary School. I was a Lindbergh Flyer. That was the mascot we had for my T-shirts on the flag football team for Lindbergh Elementary School. So Charles Lindbergh, as a person, as a heroic American figure, loomed large in my childhood long before I knew the definition of who he actually was. Why was he an important voice in this particular time period? And how did America First become synonymous with Charles Lindbergh? Bill?
It's a little bit odd that Lindbergh did become the voice of the anti-interventionist position. So I'll lay out the positions. After Britain and Germany go to war against each other, the Roosevelt administration is slowly moving the United States toward, first of all, support of Britain against Germany. And then eventually, as it's going to turn out, American intervention in the war directly on the side of Britain. Lindbergh and those who thought like him were skeptical of this. They thought this was a bad idea. They thought the United States had done this once in World War I, and that had ended badly. The peace that came out of the war was not at all what the interventionists of that era thought they had been sold going in. They thought they were going to war to make the world safe for democracy, and they didn't at all. In fact, and this was witnessed by the totalitarian regimes that grew up during the 1920s and 1930s. So they said, we shouldn't make that mistake again. So those are the two positions. And Lindbergh gravitates, he jumps fully on the side of the anti-interventionists. Now, very quickly, their foes are calling them isolationists, okay? And the isolationists, well, you know, we're just going to stick our heads in the sand. And the typical editorial cartoon from the era was an ostrich with its head in the sand while all this stuff is going on. They certainly did not acknowledge being isolationists. What they did is they had a geographically narrower view of American security. They were prepared to fight, but only if an enemy came to the United States. Their position was, we don't need to go fight. In fact, we should not go fight an enemy off in Europe because we'll wait till we're attacked or we're on the verge of attack. But anyway, Lindbergh became the spokesperson of this position because, first of all, he was an acknowledged expert on air power. And it was pretty plain by the mid-1930s that air power was going to be a big thing in this new war, in another war, should another war break out. And in fact, air power did prove to be important in the early rounds of the fighting in Europe. It was part of the German Blitzkrieg, for example. So Lindbergh is this expert on air power. He's also a celebrity. And this is a minor thing in the public view because the public's not really this aware of it. His father had been a member of Congress, and his father had been an opponent of American intervention in World War I. And he had been badly treated by the Wilson administration for disloyalty and for sedition and was driven out of politics. And Lindbergh remembered this. Part of the effect of that memory was that he became entirely opposed to the idea of politics, more precisely, of participating in politics himself. He thought that politics was a low enterprise and was filled with people who lied and shaded the truth in all sorts of directions. So he didn't want to go into politics, but he felt that America was on the wrong track if it followed Franklin Roosevelt's lead toward what seemed to be a closer step, ever closer toward intervention. And so because he was a celebrity, because he was still remembered by the American people, when he requested airtime from Mutual Broadcasting, this is radio airtime, from the Mutual Broadcasting System, from CBS, from the other networks, they were willing to give it to him because he would have an audience and they would sell ads and all be great. So Lindbergh, partly to his surprise, became the leading spokesman for the anti-interventionist position to the point where Franklin Roosevelt, the president, would give a speech saying we need to modify the neutrality legislation so the United States can sell weapons to the belligerents, for example. And Lindbergh, 3 days later, would go on the air. Roosevelt would give his speech on the radio. Lindbergh would go on the radio, give his speech opposing it, saying why Roosevelt was wrong and how it would lead to all these bad things. And so in the ears of the American public, there was this debate going on between Roosevelt and Lindbergh that lasted over 2 years. Now, they never shared the stage, but more importantly, they shared sort of the airwaves sequentially, Roosevelt, Lindbergh, and so on.
It was kind of a drawn out point counterpoint that played out for the ears of the receptive American public.
It was. And of course, behind all of this, or more precisely across the Atlantic from all of this, is the progress of the war. And so the progress of the war actually was used by both Roosevelt and Lindbergh to bolster their position. Roosevelt saying the Germans are more dangerous than we thought. So in the early spring of 1940, 6 months into the war, German armies attacked France and defeated France in a relatively short period of time. And so Roosevelt could say, look, this isn't going to be like World War I. It's not just a standoff. This is really a danger. And once the Germans conquer Europe, they're coming after us. And Lindbergh took the opposite conclusion from the same set of circumstances. He said, the war in Europe is expanding. And if anything, we need to prepare for the war if and when it comes to us. We will be much more secure if we bolster our coastal defenses with new airplanes, for example. But if we cross the Atlantic, we will be fighting on Hitler's home turf. Why give up the home field advantage? The defensive side in a war always has the edge.
And there was a very distinct hemispheric focus to the non-interventionists led by Lindbergh, which was kind of a Monroe doctrine for the 20th century, correct?
Exactly. So going back to the early 19th century, Americans had said, Europe is different from the Americas. We will pay attention to what's going on in North and South America, and we will defend the United States within the realm of North and South America, but we won't go abroad to Europe to do it. Europe is this place where our ancestors were wise to leave, and we're glad they did. And we're not going back there except under the most dire circumstances. And the dire circumstances happened in World War I, and we're not going to do it again. So Lindbergh, in fact, advocated placing American air bases all along the coasts of North and South America. And he was willing to do this even without the invitation of the South American countries, for example. He said, basically, if Brazil doesn't want these, tough luck. We're going to come in and we're going to put our bases there because we will not allow Germany, the European power he was worried about at the time, Germany to get a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And this really does go back to the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s.
And in reading in your book, Bill, Lindbergh's travels, his living in England, his travels through Europe, gave him a kind of, at least it felt to me, a jaundiced view of the European powers and where they had found themselves after World War I. And if I read the book correctly, part of his articulated argument was they're just not worth defending. They're just not worth our blood and treasure. So
Lindbergh is a complicated character in my story as he was in real life. He was an authentic expert on aircraft, air power, but he was definitely an amateur when it came to assessing the state of world affairs. He was an amateur in history. And he had this view that Britain had had its day. The British Empire had been a great thing, had been a great power in the 19th century. But the British had let their power lapse. And some of this he thought was an aspect of the British character, that the British just don't take things seriously. And they don't tend to details. And he pointed out again and again, this had had consequences for the United States in World War I. The British had gotten themselves in this war by pledging the security of Belgium. And then when the Germans attacked Belgium, they felt obliged to go to war, a war that they weren't ready for and they couldn't win on their own. So we had to go bail them out. Says Lindbergh, they've done it again. They have guaranteed the security of Poland. No way they could guarantee the security of Poland with the army, the air force they had not built up in time. And now, having gotten themselves in this fix where they declared war on Germany, and Germany's now attacking them, they're coming to us one more time to defend them. And he said, in the first go around, they said that we'll go defend British democracy. But what we really ended up defending was the British Empire, the British hold on the Middle East, the British hold on India. And that's exactly what we'll be doing again, if we do it again.
the voice of Bill Brands. When we come back for segment 3, we're going to talk about this British question and how it's long perplexed American politics dating back to our very founding. That's next. The Takeout is coming your way for segment 3 in just 1 second.
Basically, he was telling Roosevelt, if you don't send aid to us, you might be facing the British Navy operated by German forces.
Welcome back to The Takeout. The brilliant and prolific H.W. Brandt, he goes by Bill, is our special guest. His book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. So anyone who even glancingly looks at the long arc of American history will find a both fascination and revulsion with Britain. Some of the most early, intense political scrapes in America, flowing through George Washington's administration, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, was over what we thought about and how close we were or were not with Britain. This is full blown in this conversation with Roosevelt and Lindbergh.
Yeah. So, of course, the United States gained its independence after a long and bitter war against Britain. The British didn't quite give up, so the United States had to go to war against Britain again in the War of 1812. The greatest American hero of the 19th century, Andrew Jackson, became famous and beloved by Americans for defeating Britain at the Battle of New Orleans. And through the 19th century, the Americans looked distrustfully upon the British. The British appeared to be on the verge of supporting the Confederacy during America's Civil War, and the Lincoln administration had to threaten war against Britain if they did that. So the United States Americans recognize their cultural debt to Britain. We speak English, for example, and we share the common law and many traditions. But it's almost like competition conflicts within families are more intense than those with strangers. And as late as the 1930s, the US War Department had contingency plans for a possible war against Britain. And so I should add that there were certain groups in the United States who really had extra historical reason for animus against British. And this included the Irish, a very large population in the United States, because Ireland had been Britain's first overseas colony. Yep. And so the Irish, they wanted Britain to lose in World War I, and many of them would be quite happy for it to lose in World War II. So, yeah. Now, at the top of the American government, Franklin Roosevelt believed that Britain was a good ally of the United States. And part of my story, which takes place, at least at first, most of it takes place out of sight, was a secret correspondence between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill kind of embodies this ambivalence because his father was British, his mother was American. And so he got to sort of span both sides of this. And the correspondence between Roosevelt and Churchill is very interesting because both Roosevelt and Churchill realize that they are playing each other and being played by each other. And so they present the best case. And at one point during the critical moment of the Battle of Britain, Churchill essentially threatens Roosevelt with a British surrender, saying, okay, and he doesn't say I'm going to surrender, but he said we might be forced to surrender. And if we do, then I'm not sure we can keep the British fleet out of German hands. Now, there's no way that was going to happen. The British were going to sail the fleet away. But basically, he was telling Roosevelt, if you don't send aid to us, you might be facing the British Navy operated by German forces.
Right. What was Roosevelt's history before he became president that made Lindbergh and those associated with the America First movement suspicious of his not only language, but intentions, even as he was saying, hey, I'm not moving America closer to war. I'm trying to prevent our getting ensnared in this war.
Roosevelt's first federal job was Undersecretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration during World War I. And in that position, he had been centrally located in the policy of the United States during the war. Roosevelt had been all for American intervention in World War I. He, in fact, had continued to support intervention and what it led logically to, the League of Nations. This was the Wilsonian idea of a global government. This was the acme of internationalism, America taking its lead on the world stage. And he supported internationalism and the idea of the League of Nations when he ran on the Democratic ticket for president in 1920. He was the vice presidential candidate. And they lost, but he never disavowed this internationalist position. He shut up about it. He realized that the political winds were blowing in a different direction. And so when he was elected in 1932, and during the whole first term, he said nothing about international affairs. Now, people like Lindbergh could suspect, rightly as it turned out, that he hadn't changed his mind. He just was keeping something in reserve. After he got reelected in 1936, he began to talk about intervention, but when Americans were still in an isolationist mood, he didn't push it any further. And so when Roosevelt would say, in arguing for American aid to Britain, that I really don't want the United States to have to go fight in Europe. The United States does not have to take a permanent leading role. Lindbergh simply didn't believe him. And he said, here's why we shouldn't believe him, because 20 years ago, he's saying just the opposite. And we've seen many occasions where Roosevelt says one thing and does something else. And as the debate progresses, and as the United States moves closer to war, Lindbergh is able to point out every time Roosevelt said, this step will not in fact move us closer to war, but make it less likely that Americans will actually have to get involved in war. Well, every one of those steps had been followed by another step that took America closer and closer to war. So Lindbergh said, don't believe Franklin Roosevelt.
You mentioned this earlier, and I want you to drill down on it a bit, Bill. The Neutrality Acts. What were they, and why were they important in the context of this conversation?
So the Neutrality Acts were crucial as a way of signifying the sense of Congress in those days that we, Congress, we control American foreign policy. In particular, we determine war and peace. Now, Congress, speaking with its institutional memory, said we kind of screwed it up in World War I because we let Woodrow Wilson maneuver us into a position where we were attacked by German forces and therefore had no alternative but to declare war. And we're not going to let that happen again. Well, the way it happened the first time around is we let American merchants, companies trade with the belligerents. We let them lend money to belligerents. We let Americans travel on belligerent ships. And all of these things that step by step got the United States closer to war. And so the neutrality legislation, there was 3 acts passed in 1935, 36, and 37.
All signed by Roosevelt.
All signed by Roosevelt. And serially, these took out of the president's hands the ability to do those things that had gotten the United States into war. For example, American goods that were traded with the British, non-weapons, they had to be carried away on British ships rather than American ships. So if the ships got sunk in the middle of the Atlantic, they would be British ships that got sunk rather than American ships. And so when war breaks out, and the first thing Roosevelt does is say, well, we got to start repealing the Neutrality Acts, then somebody like Lindbergh said, oh, I knew this was coming. I told you it was coming, and here it is.
And in the main, leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, which ends the debate and catalyzes everyone in America into World War II, was there a core, if misguided or not, a core logic to Lindbergh's argument?
So Lindbergh's basic argument was that American interests will be better secured if America maintains a security perimeter much closer to American coast rather than Europe. That's the heart of the argument. And he says that all this other stuff is leading us astray. For example, when Franklin Roosevelt says that this is a battle of world systems, that there is a free world and a world of tyranny, and we need to support the free world. And Lindbergh said, the world is a lot more complicated than that. And by the way, by the time Roosevelt was saying this, the United States, at Roosevelt's direction, was sending American aid to the Soviet Union. And Lindbergh said, what are you talking about? They're not part of a free world. If we go to war, we will be fighting for communism. And occasionally, Roosevelt would articulate his kind of worldview. And he says, if there is a world conflict here, the divide is not between Britain and Germany. The divide is really between Germany and Russia. and everything east of Russia, including Russia and China. He said, that's where the divide will be. That's sort of a civilizational divide. And so for Britain to fight Germany, well, we couldn't stop that, but for the United States to get in on that fight, that's simply a wrong-headed thing to do, and it'll take us in the wrong direction.
More with Bill Brands. When we come back for segment 4 of the Takeout, we're going to talk about dictator and a third term for Roosevelt. That's next.
Lindbergh warned if Roosevelt is elected a third time, he'll probably run a fourth time. He'll probably be president until he dies.
Welcome back to the Takeout in this outstanding conversation with H.W. Bill Brands, University of Texas, Austin. His book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. So we just assumed that it was a kind of a nothing burger, Franklin Roosevelt winning a third term. It wasn't a nothing burger. It was a very big deal.
This was huge. And so both Lindbergh and Roosevelt would cite the advice of George Washington. And Lindbergh would say, Washington told us not to get involved in the affairs of Europe. And so, we shouldn't. But Roosevelt would say, well, Washington told us to remain strong and that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and we need to be prepared. We need to go fight abroad if necessary. Well, another thing that Washington had not so much said as done was he modeled that presidents get two terms. Now, it wasn't written into the Constitution then, but it had been this norm for a century and a half of America's existence. And everybody expected when Roosevelt was reelected in 1936 that would be it. He'd have a second term, and then he'd be done. Now, exactly at what point Roosevelt decided 2 terms was not enough is a little bit unclear, because one of the puzzles about working with Roosevelt, one of the things that makes him actually very intriguing is that it's really hard to tell what Roosevelt is thinking because he never leveled with anybody. And as far as I can tell, he didn't
not even his closest confidants.
Yeah, exactly. So, but at some point, Roosevelt decided he's going to go for a third term. Now, whether the emergency overseas, whether the war in Europe was the cause of this change of mind, or if it was just the excuse, the rationalization, is a little bit hard to say. And with presidents and people in positions like that, you probably can't tease them out entirely. But Lindbergh believed that this would be another disadvantage and another very negative consequence of getting involved in the war, because it would invite presidents to do the kind of things that Roosevelt had done and extend themselves into power indefinitely. And Lindbergh warned if Roosevelt is elected a third time, he'll probably run a fourth time. He'll probably be president until he dies, which is exactly what happened. And so, but in the larger sense, Lindbergh was saying that the American people are losing control of their own foreign policy because Congress is gradually abdicating it to the president. And so we are developing Franklin Roosevelt, in the name of combating dictatorships, is making himself an American equivalent of the dictators abroad.
So, as you know, Bill, young Americans, if they think at all about Charles Lindbergh, or they do some quick searching or social media, they might find references to him that are decidedly negative. Depictions of him at varying from Nazi sympathizer, Nazi apologist, to straight up anti-Semite. I mentioned at the beginning of segment 2 that my elementary school was named after Charles Lindbergh. It no longer is. The neighborhood in which I grew up, in a very genial, gentle, lengthy process in which everyone had a voice, decided to take the name off of my elementary school. It's now called Claremont Canyons Academy. I'm not upset about that. It's a reflection of the times in which we live. Assess Charles Lindbergh and his legacy, and what epithets, if that's the proper term, ought to stick and what ones ought not to stick.
So the first thing I will say is that the people who were loudest in proclaiming Lindbergh to be a Nazi sympathizer and an anti-Semite had decided political reasons for doing so. These were uniformly people who opposed his political point of view, and they thought they could discredit his argument by discrediting the person making the argument. Now, that doesn't necessarily make their complaints right or wrong.
It's a very similar, it's a very typical ad hominem tactic.
Precisely, precisely. So the principal evidence that Lindbergh was an anti-Semite came from a speech that he gave in the autumn of 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, where he said there are three groups in the United States that are most influential in trying to get the United States involved in the war in Europe. The first group, he said, was the British government and their propaganda bureau in America. And Lindbergh said it's entirely understandable that they should be doing this. They are at war, they're fighting for their lives. They think that we can come bail them out. I understand that, and I don't gainsay their right to do so. He said the second group is Jewish Americans. And he said it's perfectly understandable that Jewish Americans could feel that it would be good for the people they love, the ones in Europe, in many cases, friends, relatives in Europe, and that they would feel a certain obligation to come to the defense of their co-religionists by, the United States going in. He said it's perfectly understandable that they feel that way. They have every right to state that position, but I don't think that should be the position of the United States. And the third group, and the one that he was most virulently critical of, was the Roosevelt administration. And he went on at great length explaining how Franklin Roosevelt was using this. So on the strength of having injected the word Jewish American into the debate, Lindbergh the next day was blasted in newspapers and editorials all around the country. And it was something that, it was a label that never left. So,
and in part of that speech in Des Moines, because it's all in your book, Lindbergh also says Jewish Americans exercise outsized control over powerful institutions in America.
Right. And in fact, what he was referring to was the fact, and in this case, it was personal with him, because nobody disputed the fact that Jewish Americans had a very large role in Hollywood in that day. And the Hollywood studios are the ones who produced the movie newsreels. And this was the way people got their news. And Lindbergh had been dealing with the newsreel photographers, and they were the ones who drove him out of the country. And so he had it personally against them for that. So yes, he said this. And Lindbergh was he was not surprised that there was this reaction against the speech by injecting this question, and it was usually labeled in terms of injecting the question of religion into the debate. But he was surprised at the strength of it and the fact that the America First Committee distanced itself from Lindbergh.
Yep.
And he went to Herbert Hoover, and in honest puzzlement, he said, "What did I say that was wrong, that was factually incorrect?" And what Herbert Hoover said, in essence, was, it's not that what you said was wrong, it's simply that you were wrong to say it. And so Lindbergh felt badly put upon, and at the same time, his reputation was tarnished pretty much ever after as a result of that. And the fact that your school was renamed is evidence that that's the impression that still sticks.
The impression that still sticks. Bill Brandt, it's been a great pleasure to have you. I want to remind the audience of the title of the book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. Incidentally, folks, you will find yourself delighted if you go into the larger volume of H.W. Brand's books. They're all terrific. They're all enormous contributions to American history. So not just this book, but anything he has authored. H.W. Brand's, Bill Brandt, has been great to have you with us. Everyone, stay tuned for your Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial.
The folk rock music of the 1960s is exemplified by the group, the Byrds. I thought was just fantastic.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. Everyone knows this is typically our fun and games segment. H.W. Bill Brands, outstanding history professor and writer based at the University of Texas, Austin. So we have 3 questions, Bill. We ask everyone, take them in whichever order you prefer. Like I said, this is fun and games, so it's a little bit lighter.
Okay.
Most influential book in your life and why? One of your all-time favorite movies, or if you have an all-time favorite, please let us know. And if you're on a long flight or a long drive and you're thoroughly going to enjoy some music, what artist or genre is that most likely to be?
Okay, so the most influential book was a historical novel called Children of the Covered Wagon. It was by a woman named Mary Jane Carr. I read this when I was probably 8 years old, and it took place along the Oregon Trail. Now, I grew up in Oregon, and I read it at my grandparents' house that was literally right beside the western part of the western end of the Oregon Trail. And I imagined myself and my siblings running around and in the covered wagon. In fact, my grandparents, they were so willing to dote on their grandkids that they went out and bought an old wagon to place on the property that we'd play there. So that's the most influential book. My favorite movie is Dr. Strangelove from
Beautiful.
the 60s. And this was one where it was my first exposure to the really sort of dark comedy that a lot of people felt that they had to indulge in during the Cold War, when the specter of nuclear war, kind of fell in on their heads. And I can still remember when my eldest child, my daughter Margie, was an infant, and this was back in the early 1980s, and she couldn't sleep, and I would get up and walk her around and try to get back to sleep. And this was before the days of cable and all stuff.
Right.
A couple of times they would play Dr. Strangelove at 2:00 in the morning. And so Margie's first exposure to media was Dr. Strangelove, which I'm not sure what effects it had on her developing mind.
You can't fight here. This is the war room.
So in the question of music, again, I'm going to go back to my earlier years. And the folk rock music of the 1960s is exemplified by the group, the Byrds. Mm-hmm. I thought was just fantastic. They typically they often took songs by Bob Dylan and put a different spin to them. And so even when I hear it today, I'm transported back to when I was 16.
That's fantastic. We have never had that answer. Children of the Covered Wagon or the lyrical story about it. That is spectacular. H.W. Bill Brandt, it's been a delight. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time, and many congratulations, not only on this book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War, but all the others. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, sir.
Thanks, Major. Delighted to talk to you.
We'll see you. Okay, I promised some important news, but I have to read it. This show has never, ever been scripted, but trust me, at least the beginning part of this I need to have written down. Here we go. The Takeout, as we've come to know it, ends this week. This is our last show in this format. We've been doing this together for 8 years, and it's been the joy and privilege of my career to spend every week with you. When I open the show saying, welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week, I mean it. I mean it with every fiber of my being. Just know the Takeout is not dying. We have plans. I can't share them fully with you right now. Just know that evolution is real, and the Takeout, its spirit, its curiosity, its informality, and yes, I hope even the food and beverage will live on. And when that time comes, it is my hope you will join us. And I make you this promise. You won't have to wait long to find out what comes next. This show has been a gift to me, one that very soon will give in a different way to me, and I hope to you. For those of you who took time to stop me in airports to tell me that you love this show, just know those encounters have meant more to me than I can describe. Just know, until we get to that next phase, thank you. Thank you for being with us here, week in and week out. You have always been, and will always be, the very best part of my broadcast week. Until then.